The Widow of Zarephath. Have you ever stopped to think how faith can turn the impossible into reality? Today, we will dive into one of the most inspiring stories in the Bible, the Widow of Zarephath. In the midst of drought, hunger, and despair, a simple woman teaches us profound lessons about trust, generosity, and the power of divine provision. Get ready to be moved and reflect as we discover how God works miracles through the most humble hearts. If you enjoy stories full of purpose and spirituality, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any transformative messages. Let's journey together. In times of great drought, when the lands turned into parched deserts and the rivers disappeared, leaving only furrows of dust in the cracked soil, the Lord spoke to the prophet Elijah. God, always attentive to the cries of his servants, commanded Elijah to go to the city of Zarephath in Sidon, a region beyond the borders of Israel and foreign to faith in the living God. There, in a strange land and among a people who did not recognize the God of Israel, he had prepared a heart to welcome his prophet. This divine command was a clear sign that God's grace is limitless, surpassing cultural, geographical, and spiritual barriers. It was also a powerful reminder that, even in places seemingly distant from his presence, God is at work, preparing paths and hearts. When Elijah arrived at the city gates, he found a woman gathering sticks. This woman was a widow, a figure that symbolized human vulnerability and fragility. At that time, widows were often left to the mercy of fate, living on the margins of society and depending on the generosity of others to survive. The weight of the drought that ravaged the region seemed reflected in her countenance, marked by the constant struggle against hunger and despair. Upon seeing her, Elijah did not hesitate to approach her, asking for a little water. It was a simple request, but one filled with meaning. Water, the source of life, had become a rare and precious resource. Still, the woman, without hesitation, was willing to fulfill that request. This small act of generosity in the face of scarcity was like a flickering light in the darkness, revealing that, even in the harshest of adversities, the human heart is capable of sharing. As she went to fetch the water, Elijah called to her again, now with another request, a piece of bread. This request revealed the depth of poverty in which the woman lived. With honesty and sorrow, she explained that she had no bread. All that remained in her house was a handful of flour in a bowl and a few drops of oil in a jar. Her plan was to prepare one last meal for herself and her son before waiting for death, as there was nothing else she could do to resist the hunger that slowly consumed them. Her words reflected her resignation, a hope almost extinguished. Each grain of flour and each drop of oil represented not only scarcity, but also the crushing weight of a future without hope. Elijah, however, brought with him not only a request, but a word of hope. He asked her to first make a small cake for him and then prepare something for herself and her son. In exchange, he announced the promise of the God of Israel. The flour in the bowl would not run out, and the oil in the jar would not fail until the day the Lord sent rain upon the earth. This request required an extraordinary act of faith. The widow would need to give up the little she had, offering what seemed to be her last chance of survival. How many times in our own lives are we challenged to take such a bold step of faith? The widow stood before a dilemma that transcended human logic: to trust in a divine promise or cling to the security of what she had in her hands, however little it was. Moved by a faith that perhaps she herself did not fully understand, the widow chose to obey. She used the last handful of flour and the last drops of oil to make the cake and offer it to the prophet. And then the miracle happened. As Elijah had said, the bowl of flour never emptied and the jar of oil never ran dry. Day after day, as the drought continued to ravage the land, that house in Zarephath became a refuge of abundance. Each meal prepared was a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness. Every morning, the widow, her son, and the prophet were welcomed by divine provision, a living testimony that God is capable of turning the little into much and sustaining those who trust in him. This story is more than a tale of material provision. It is a profound lesson about faith, obedience, and generosity. The widow could have refused, fearing for the life of her son and her own life. However, she chose to trust in God's promise. And in that choice, she found not only sustenance but a transformative experience. Elijah, in turn, also teaches us something precious. Even in the face of adverse circumstances, he trusted in God's word and had the courage to deliver it with hope and firmness. The flour and oil that never ran out symbolize God's grace that never ends. Just as the widow shared the little she had, God calls us to be generous, even when we believe we have little to offer. And in doing so, we discover that in His hands, our little becomes enough to meet not only our own needs, but also the needs of others. This story invites us to trust even when the circumstances seem desperate. It reminds us that God is our faithful provider, our light in the darkness, and that His grace flows constantly, renewing our strength and hopes. Furthermore, this story highlights how God uses ordinary people to fulfill His extraordinary purposes. The widow of Zarephath was not a woman of position or great influence. She was a simple figure, facing the daily struggles of life. Yet, God chose her as a channel of His blessing, both for Elijah and for herself and her son. This reminds us that God sees the potential in each of us, regardless of our limitations or circumstances. He calls us to trust in Him, to be instruments of His grace, and to experience the abundance of His faithfulness. The story of the widow of Zarephath and Elijah is a powerful testimony that God is capable of turning scarcity into abundance, despair into hope, and weakness into strength. May we be inspired by this account to trust God in every area of our lives, certain that He is our sustenance, our strength, and our hope. As we reflect on this miracle, we are called to consider the ways in which God invites us to be instruments of provision and hope for others. The widow did not know that her small act of obedience would impact her story in such a significant way, just as we often cannot fully comprehend the reach of our acts of faith and generosity. When we trust in God and allow Him to work through us, even the smallest gesture can become an immeasurable blessing in someone else's life. Thus, may we continue the story, remembering that God is not limited by our expectations and always acts in surprising ways. The widow's act of trusting in what seemed like an impossible promise not only ensured her physical survival, but also strengthened her faith and gave her a new purpose. Each day she witnessed the multiplication of the flour and oil. Her soul was renewed, and her heart learned more about the depth of divine faithfulness. God, in His infinite wisdom, uses the most adverse situations to shape and teach us. The widow, by letting go of the little she had, became an active participant in God's plan, not only as a recipient of a miracle, but as a living example of faith and obedience. Her story echoes to this day, inviting us to reflect on our own lives. Where are we being called to trust? Where are we challenged to share our little and believe that God will multiply it for His glory? Elijah, in turn, remained a symbol of absolute dependence on God. Before being sent to Zarephath, he had been sustained by ravens and the water of a brook, a provision as unusual as it was miraculous. Now, in the house of a foreign widow, he once again saw God's faithfulness manifest in an unexpected way. Each shared meal was a reminder that God always fulfills His promises, even when His provisions defy human logic. The narrative of the widow of Zarephath does not end with physical provision. It points us to something even greater, God's eternal purpose in using our lives as a testimony of His goodness and power. Just like that woman, we are called to live in a way that our faith inspires others to trust in God, even in the most challenging situations. May we, like her, open ourselves to the possibility of miracles in the midst of scarcity and hope in the midst of despair. Finally, the story of the widow of Zarephath is a reminder that, in God, we are never alone. He sees our needs, hears our cries, and acts on our behalf, often in ways we could never imagine. May we walk with this confidence, knowing that the God who multiplied the oil and flour in that humble house in Zarephath is the same God who sustains our lives today and forever. As we conclude our reflection on the powerful story of the Widow of Zarephath, we are reminded that true faith does not depend on circumstances, but on trust in the God who is faithful in every situation. Even when everything seems lost, when resources run out and hope fades, God reveals himself as our provider, capable of turning the little into abundance and despair into hope. The widow teaches us that, even in the midst of scarcity, generosity and obedience to God have the power to open doors for miracles. May we, like her, be instruments of faith and trust, sharing what we have, however small it may seem, and experiencing God's faithfulness in our lives. He always calls us to take a step of faith, and when we obey, we are surprised by his goodness. May this story continue to inspire our hearts, reminding us that, with God, provision never fails and hope never dies. If this message has touched your heart and strengthened your faith, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. This helps us continue bringing inspiring stories and teachings into your life and sharing more words of hope with everyone. May God bless your life abundantly, and until the next video.